Well, it's week 9 already, or maybe you're not quite thinking that. It's finally week 9. And today we're going to talk about two approaches to environmental problems. And the themes for today are that different approaches work better or worse depending on the knowledge, control, and values. And we saw that last week. And that sometimes the values can be dealt with by finding a common ground that's maybe that helps resolve some contentious values. And sometimes a market approach can be used to help negotiate those value disparities. And those are the two approaches we're going to look at today. Multiple criteria, which I'm going to talk about in this first part of the lecture, and then social and environmental entrepreneurs, which I'm going to talk about in part 2. And before we go on, just a few comments about the worldviews that people have. And we try to say that individuals may have worldviews that we aspire to rather than what we actually are fully able to live up to. And that's fine. And in my own case, I like to explain it as that this is a consequence of having all of these conflicts and constraints in our daily life, and that just trying to live a sustainable and a green existence in an industrialized, fast-paced society. There's some inherent contradictions in our everyday life and our longer-term philosophies that are we just have to keep working on them. We're never going to be like pure environmentalists or pure hierarchists. There's just a lot of inconsistencies. So one of the things about a course like this is help you identify your own values, the values of the people around you, and learn to deal with that in a way that moves these environmental questions forward. Okay, let's return to this table about knowledge, control, and values. And today we're going to talk about, last week we talked about scenarios. And this week we're going to talk about environmental entrepreneurism, which has low knowledge and is high uncertainty. There's a degree of control because we're going to invoke sort of market mechanisms. And then there's a low alignment of values that the market helps sort out. And the other one is we're going to look at this multi-criteria analysis, and this is sort of like setting up a scenario. It doesn't really lead to an answer, but it helps identify those. And there's a high degree of knowledge, and that you'll see why that is. And then there's really low control. We're not at the stage of actually implementing a solution yet, and there's a low alignment of values, and that's what we're trying to get at. So in this part 1, we're going to talk about multi-criteria. So they're multi-criteria decision-making or multiple attribute method for decision-making. And this approach requires a high information availability. And that's because we're going to ask all the participants and stakeholders to make statements of goals and their objectives. Those statements have to be honest, and we need to be able to check those. And then also we're going to assign some utility values to all of those, which really requires quite a bit of knowledge about every little aspect of the project. And in addition, the process itself has to be well managed by knowledgeable mediators. So this is a really knowledge-rich environment. Before we saw, if you really don't know too much, you could create different scenarios. This one is maybe to address a particular problem. And I'm going to give you an example in a little bit, but this way to handle the different dimensions of values is often in public discourse, there's a conflict of values. And if these are handled just one at a time or handled differently in each case, it really, there's a big toss to that. Every decision-making process has to ramp up and has to go through that. So in this case, we're trying to shift the debate to try to, what are the rules for making the decision, and then go through those steps. And there's a traditional ways of making decisions called folkways. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, and we often think that these sort of traditional decision-making systems must have worked, but often we'll see now that in a complex situation, they just aren't applicable. So the idea with multi-attributes is to bring in many different goals and values and associate those with, when we have some particular project, what are the utilities to these different people? And we can get the utility, say the example we're going to talk about is coastal zone management. We could get the utility of putting in a parking lot or having a bird watching area, these different things. We could do it experimentally, we can have observations, we can do some sort of judgment or combination of all of those. And we have to provide some sort of weighting factors for those. And this is judgment at each step, so it requires a lot of care and in the process. We're going to look at a case study in just a second that talks about this with a coastal zone management. And we're going to do this with a 10-step method. And this 10-step method is called some sort of SMART technique, simple, multi-attribute, blah, 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 blah. I really hate things that are smart or whatever. I mean, that's not a way to start out a discussion because it assumes that everything else is dumb. But in this case, it's a highly refined and decision method. And the way it's going to work is you can read through these 10 steps, and I encourage you to come back and look at the notes and read through those. But the idea is to identify who the actors are and who's getting out of each thing, identify the dimensions of the value, and then rank those dimensions relative to values. Okay, and then when we get down to step 8, we're going to be looking at measuring aspects of the location, getting very specific information about how the interaction between one dimension fits against another dimension. And we saw this before with this optimization. Remember, we had biodiversity versus economic development Oregon. It's like that. Is it a straight off trade? Is there some sort of synergies or some sort of interference? Okay, so let's just look at this. I don't want to go through all of these right now. You can read through these and sort of see these steps. But what I want to do is just give you a case example of how this worked. So there was a case of a coastal zone development, and they had this competition for the resources in the zone really area and what they were going to do with that. Were they going to put in a hotel in a parking lot, or were they going to have some natural area? And what they did is they had a group, just to sort of do a study on this, they had a group process 15 hypothetical permit requests. And those all dealt with the size and the distance to the ocean and the density of development, building height, land use, etc., aesthetics. And then they went back through and looked at these using this tool. And what they saw is that when they had these disagreements over judging aspects of this, usually came down into two types of disagreement. The first type was at step 8 up there, which is you're looking at very specific steps in very specific attributes. And if those were not too large, they could just sort of throw out the outliers and keep the main factors. And that means, like, are you going to make a parking lot that's for 150 cars or 125 cars? You can just sort of figure out what's sort of an intermediate level there. But if there was a disagreement in steps 5 and 6, that is here, steps 5 and 6 are rank the dimensions and rate the importance relative to each other. That is really where it's a different kind of disagreement. And that disagreement is a conflict over values. And so the choice there is if you make those very clear, those values very clear, then you can say, well, we value these things and you value these other things, and you can make those assumptions very clear instead of like trying to weave that into your argument and get your values met in the end. You have to state them right up front. Well, in this case, what the general study showed was that there was disagreement over some aspects of the problem, but actually when they got down to sort of what the core values could be, both sets of environmentalists and developers could have their values met if the project was designed correctly. And this is like what we saw with the environmental, the biodiversity versus economic development. There's sort of solutions that are a combination that provide high utility for both without really interfering with the utility for the others. So in this case, you wouldn't want to have all hotels and parking lots, and you wouldn't want to have all bird sanctuaries, but you could have some sort of mix, and what that mix is really what you're trying to get at. Okay, now these types of decisions you can really try to understand the different values people brings to these decisions, and you don't have to endorse these values, and you don't have to try to really work in a value-laden situation, you can try to identify what those values are. And here's another example, and it's from a book called Beyond Blue and Red. It's about political philosophies. And you can look at these philosophies here, and these are all stated in terms of the state should promote, so, theocracy, the state should promote values of a particular religion. And you can go down through this and read these. And there's 12 philosophies, and this book is really good at showing cases where these different underlying philosophies actually came together to help either define a conflict or find a resolution. And the one I'm going to talk about today deals with 4 of these philosophies: free market conservative, libertarianism, contractarians, and environmentalist. And this was the case where there was a proposed development in New London. And what they were going to do is use eminent domain to take people's property and use it for development, and that included other housing. So they were actually going to take away people's houses to build other houses. But it was also going to build a shopping center and some other things would promote economic development. Well, it wasn't to build a highway. This is how it's normally been used. So this was a very contentious exercise. And the different aspects here, of course, the environmentalists wanted to have a very dense population and promote mass transit. The free market conservatives wanted to do this because it would increase the wealth of the community. The libertarianism was against this because they said that the government has no right to take people's lands, and the contractarians said we needed to protect the vulnerable. So this is very interesting because the libertarians and the contractarians would usually disagree about one wants small government, one wants big government, but they agreed on this. And the environmentalists and the free market conservatives, usually at opposite ends of the spectrum, also agreed on this, but for different reasons. So here by highlighting these sort of underlying philosophies and these groups, you can also dissect what some of the aspects of this problem were. Okay, this is just one example, and I'm not trying to push these particular 12 philosophies on everybody. It was just that as a decision, helping to make a decision, this is a way to get at it. Try to dissect and get down to these values that people hold, make them state that in an honest way, and then use, based on that, work towards some sort of solution. Now, the final point on this multiple criteria is that one of the tools that is used in this is to use modeling. And we can use systems models to collect new information from the public. And we saw this when we did the genuine progress indicator model for Maryland. So the idea is you set up a model, it has an easy user face, it's easy for people to look at and work, and you allow the people to adjust the parameters or add new elements in more sophisticated models, and then run those simulations and see what they think. What relative investment would they make remember in the genuine progress indicator, what relative investment would they make in green jobs, smart growth, or clean energy? So this brings in new sorts of information. And another example is the Northwest Power Planning Council had a model like this. It was very easy to look at and very complicated underneath, but they took it around and showed it to all sorts of different stakeholders. And from that, they discovered that the people who had fished on the river for a long time realized had this understanding that after the reservoirs had been put in, they were losing a lot of smolt going out, and from that they discovered a major loss at each dam due to predation. So when we use systems models like this to help make decisions, it helps explore the impact of choices, explore the relative strengths of the different parameters, how they actually work, and lets the public understand that. But in order to do that, we need an open modeling environment that makes these assumptions clear. It's not all just hidden in the background. That people have to trust that this model is giving a realistic idea of what could happen. And then, but when you put all these together, it really supports democratic processes that are necessary in these complex environments that we're dealing with. All right, in part 2, I'm going to be talking about social and environmental entrepreneurism.